All right. Okay. You guys all can see my screen now?
Yes.
All right. I am going to be talking to you all about the SAM tool. So we're improving water quality throughout Minnesota using the Scenario Application Manager, or SAM version 2. So we've updated the version, and so it's going to be different for you guys if you start downloading the new SAM tools throughout the state. On the agenda today, I am going to give you just a background of kind of what's going on in Minnesota in with SAM, tell you how the HSPF model works very briefly, go through the SAM workflow, functionality of SAM, and then kind of how we develop it, and then talk about some of these updates that we've done. And then I'm going to get into how we've used SAM for TMDLs, RAPs, one watershed, one plans, for tool linkages, for targeting in smaller subwatersheds, and then some other projects that we've worked on. So just to start out with the quick background, as most of you guys know, Minnesota has a 10-year cycle that they're working on for the water quality, water management. So they start out by just doing the monitoring and assessment, development, or figuring out what water bodies are impaired, doing the stressor ID, all of that sort of thing. And then they move into the characterization and problem investigation portion of that, and then development of RAPs projects and TMDLs, and then the comprehensive watershed management planning, and then just that ongoing implementation. So then they just, once that's done, they just start it over again. So every 10 years, they're just rolling through this cycle. And the three parts that we mostly help with when it comes to SAM and HSPF are that water resource characterization and problem investigation, the RAPs and TMDL process, and then that comprehensive watershed management planning. And so HSPF comes into that, and RESPEC is known for our HSPF modeling. We just love it. And the problem with HSPF is that it is not easy for the end user. So when we develop an HSPF model for MPCA or for a different state, it's really difficult to hand over this QCI file that's got thousands and thousands of lines of code, and then all of these, hundreds of inputs in a WDM file to a user, and have them be able to pull results or to be able to run scenarios with it afterwards. So then they would have to come back to us to get any of that stuff done. So we wanted to come up with a solution where we could hand this great tool over to the end users who are going to be making decisions in a watershed. So that's where SAM comes in. We go from the sad guy looking at the HSPF screen to this little happy man using SAM. So what SAM is going to do for the end user is make it easy to extract and analyze all the model results without having to call RESPEC back up again. To be able to run scenarios and to run them correctly and standardized in a standardized way so people understand exactly what they did. And in that, it'll require minimal knowledge of how to run and use the HSPF, UCI and WDM files and things like that. So how does HSPF work? The HSPF is the basis of SAM, and so it's very important to kind of understand the background of HSPF. This model has been vetted for over 40 years. It's a model that is the core watershed model for the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers. In Minnesota, we are running it continuously on an hourly time step. And so from about 1995 till present, or whenever we updated that model last, we can get an output at any subwatershed outlet throughout an entire HUC 8 on an hourly time step of all of these different parameters like flow, phosphorus, nitrogen, sediment, all of these things. And so when we run these scenarios, we can get those outputs at that same time step, or any smaller time step if we want something a little less clunky than an hourly time step. The model represents whatever land uses are the most important in any watershed. When we're looking at the watershed in northern Minnesota, it's more forest driven. And so we'll try to look at forest practices and stuff. Where when we're looking at more southern Minnesota, it's more cropland driven towards the cities. We've got a lot more development. So we'll kind of break out our land covers in those HSPF models to best represent what's going on in the watershed, so that when we're running scenarios, it's going to be the most beneficial and useful for the people who are making decisions in that watershed. And then it represents what's going on the surface of the land, below the surface, kind of that infiltration thing, and then what's happening in streams and in the lake. So those hydrology and water quality processes are being represented in this model. So how we build this is we'll actually collect the precipitation data and all of this other meteorological data, and we just in the model will rain down on all of these different land covers and all of these different subwatersheds, and then that water in the model will move over and through the land to the stream, essentially. And so we'll parameterize this model and look at how the water is infiltrating, how much, shade is there impacting the temperature in the stream on the land, how much cover is there, stopping the water from making it all the way to the ground when it rains. There's all these different parameters. So we look at that, and then we'll actually calibrate the model to what's happening in the stream. And so we start by looking at flow. And then once we finish looking at flow, then we start looking at all the different water quality. And often have daily data with resources, flow, and all the different water quality parameters. And then again, that instream processing, how phosphorus and nitrogen are being used up and how dissolved oxygen is increasing and decreasing throughout the day based on respiration and all of that stuff. It's being represented in stream in every subwatershed of a Huckay, which a lot of times there's 50 to 75 different subwatersheds represented. Once we have an HSPF model built, then we can run BMPs and scenarios to develop implementation plans and use it however we want to use it. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about the calibration. Again, we're looking at 50 to 100 watersheds, and we have data. We start by collecting the data that's available during that 1995 to present time period at all of the locations throughout the watershed. And so we'll collect those and develop calibration plots for all of those. So when we're looking at the hydrology calibration, you can see this first daily plot in the upper left-hand corner. We'll plot the simulated data versus the observed data wherever it's available. And the red is simulated, the blue is observed. And so we look at that on a daily time step, and you can see how well that blue and red line matches up there. Sometimes we'll have R squareds of between 0.9 and 0.98. It matches up very, very well, and we really predict that stream flow in the watersheds very well. And then we look at it on a seasonal time step from month to month and make sure that we're hitting things like snow melt and all those different processes that are happening, that runoff process and all of that. And on a yearly time step to make sure that the dry years are showing up as dry years and the wet years are showing up as wet years. We look at duration curves, all sorts of things. And then once the hydrology is calibrated, we move into this water quality calibration. So we look at sediments. We're looking at how the sediment is eroding gullies and things like that, but also what's happening in stream with how it's being stirred up and deposited as you go from upstream to downstream. Again, respiration and all the things that are happening with algae and chlorophyll A based on how the phosphorus and nitrogen species, we're looking at all of this, and we look at it on a daily time step, on a monthly average, these box plot time steps. We look at duration curves, and we're trying to just get that red line to match up with those blue dots or blue box plots as well as we can, using literature values and making sure that all of the sources are in a reasonable range. And these are some new plots we started making for the calibration that I just really like. So I wanted to show you these. These are kind of as you go from upstream to downstream. This one was in the Sauk River, but how well that overall kind of average is matching up with the observed data in the stream throughout the entire watershed. So each of these numbers on the bottom of these plots is a reach in the watershed that has data. And so you can kind of see how well this represents what's actually happening in the watershed for total phosphorus, total suspended solids, and total nitrogen. I just think these plots are really cool because they give an idea of how great these models really are, and how helpful they can be for use for TMDLs, RAPs, one watershed, one plans, and all of those things. So getting into SAM a little bit more, what we want to do is come up with something to facilitate watershed management and decision making by you guys. So we take that HSPF watershed model, and we have a BMP database for the state of Minnesota. And so we take those two things together and put it into this SAM tool, and then you can do and run watershed scenarios to come up with what the future conditions are going to be. And then, you know, the big thing I'm going to go into now is how we use SAM to prioritize, target, and measure in all of these watersheds. So SAM, if you look at that top corner, the green watersheds up there are all the watersheds where SAM projects exist and can be downloaded on the RESPEC website. So what SAM will do for you is it'll help you determine the pollutants of concern. We can use it to identify any critical locations or sources in any subwatershed, and then down to like land use and point sources in those subwatersheds or at any outlet throughout the watershed. We can use SAM to develop custom scenarios, and it also develops optimized scenarios, which I'll get into a little bit later on. And then you can analyze, not only can you analyze the scenarios, but you can also do analysis just on what's happening in the watershed. It will build plots, pie charts, all sorts of cool things. And then it can be used for reporting for TMDLs. It'll output flows and stuff for the TMDLs that you need to build TMDL tables and things like that. So identifying pollutants of concern. First, you can jump into this Analyze tab that you see on SAM. And this is where you can filter it by flow, you can make plots, you can look at maps, you can do all sorts of things, but really evaluating, you know, what are our concentrations and loads that we're seeing throughout the watershed, and where do we need to focus our efforts. Again, that where do we need to focus our efforts, you can look at the locations and sources, and so you can see here, in this specific watershed, we're seeing some high nitrogen loads in these specific watersheds. And then you can take and parse that out further by where in those subwatersheds are those loads coming from. Is it coming from cropland? Is there a big point source that's contributing? What's happening there? So here's another critical location sources. This is where you would pull out your subwatershed, and or for the entire watershed, you can look at what's happening. So you can see here, you can look at, in this one specifically, it was cropland causing the issue primarily, and then everything else was kind of an equal contributor. So cropland would be where you'd want to start running your scenarios and targeting best management practices. All right, and then customizing scenarios. So there are tons of scenarios. You can see kind of a list right here, and you can run as many or as little few scenarios as you want to in SAM. You can put your scenario in, and then you can say, I want to edit the costs. That we have this database, and so you can edit the costs, you can edit the participation level, and you can do all sorts of things, and you can add 4 or 5 scenarios. You can pick different efficiency factors, which I can also call them reduction factors. How much is the phosphorus going to be reduced when we run this scenario? So you can change those if you have a different literature source you want to use, or you can use some of the ones that are included in SAM. There's some different options if you want to kind of look at the differences. And then there's land use change scenarios too. So if I want to say that we're going to take 10% of the cropland and change it to grassland, I can do that. Or I can say I want to double the cropland or double the developed land in a certain subwatershed. You can do all sorts of things Another thing you can do is say that this point source is going to have a lot lower phosphorus limit. And so we want to see when that gets kicked into place, how that's going to impact the new load downstream. And you can look at how septics, reducing septics is going to change your loads downstream. If you got an increase in septics, say there was a new development and everybody was going to be on septics, how's that going to impact the water quality? There are so many options in this tool that you can do, and we do offer trainings and stuff if anybody wants them, because some of it can get a little complicated. There's a ton of options and it can do so many things. It's really great. There's also climate change scenarios you can run that increase the extreme precipitation and the average air temperature. There's like a mild, a moderate, and a severe climate change option you can do. So again, all sorts of options to customize your scenarios to whatever is important to you in your watershed. I had also mentioned optimizing scenarios. And so you can say that, I only have this many dollars and this is my goal load to get to. So you can put that into SAM and say, okay, I have $20,000 and I need to get my concentration down to the standard of 50 micrograms or milligrams per liter or something, and you run it, and SAM will tell you where in the watershed would be the best to run what BMPs would be the best to put on to get the most bang for your buck to reach your goals that you want to reach. So that's a really cool thing SAM can do as well. So you'll run these scenarios and then you can do analysis on those. So you can see in this plot right here, the base scenario showed what the concentration of orthophosphate was, and then what happened with a couple of other scenarios and how much those increased or decreased. And again, the more area that you're running those scenarios on, the bigger impact you're going to see. But you can start small and then go big to really see how much you need to do to get to your goals in your watershed. And then you can also evaluate what the reductions were when you ran that scenario in any given watershed. So you could see what watersheds would be the best to run those scenarios, or to actually put those scenarios or BMPs on the ground in based on what SAM is outputting. And then again, it outputs things for TMDLs. And so you can see here, we can get the 90th percentile total phosphorus loads in different flow regimes, which is a lot of times you'll do E. coli and TSS TMDLs by flow regimes in whatever reach you're wanting to look at. You can look at what the reduction is needed to get to your target concentrations or loads for your TMDLs. You can pull median flows for every flow zone for different seasons. It does all sorts of things. Whatever seasons you want to look at, whatever years you want to look at, you can do that with SAM. So how do we make these SAM tools? We actually have, I talked about the HSPF model and how that has thousands and thousands of lines of code. And then we have this WDM file that houses all of these continuous time series of precipitation, evaporation, snow, all of the lake level, all of the things we calibrate to. And so we just have this intermediate tool called PATH, and we can input kind of the linkages in HSPF and what the files are and what the land covers are. And we at RESPEC can just click a button, run it, and it'll make a new SAM. So it's actually a pretty easy process that can take less than an hour if the HSPF model is developed and the database is developed. We have our database developed for Minnesota, and then our SAM framework. So the HSPF and the PATH take a knowledgeable watershed modeler, but then SAM can be, anybody can use SAM that's, understands BMPs and watersheds. So. What goes into this database that I'm talking about? The SAM database, probably the most important thing is, obviously the HSPF model, but what these scenario efficiencies and reduction factors are for every scenario that's represented. So you can see here on the right, that's the list of all of the actual scenarios that we have. And We have different efficiencies or reduction factors for different components of the model for flow, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and sediment. The next thing that goes into it is costs. How much does each scenario cost per acre per year, I believe is what the units are. And then how much of the land in every subwatershed would actually be impacted by that scenario. So if you're going to put in a buffer, it's not necessarily going to impact all of the cropland in that subwatershed. It's going to be a certain amount of cropland within a certain distance of that watershed. So land suitability is in there. Also land availability. Is there already, is that BMP already installed on half of the cropland in that watershed? If it is, then we don't want to run it again. So that's an important thing that we have in the same database. In the HSPF model file, there's land uses, but there's that, you saw that land use change component. So you could say our developed land is increasing by this much. So it'll pull that from the HSPF model. And then those point source time series so that we can edit those and run different point source scenarios for permitting and waste load allocation development for TMDLs. So some of the places where we get all of this information for the database, and therefore the flow, sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Those reduction factors and efficiencies, we worked with Dave Wall for the agricultural ones and worked to find the best efficiencies from the Minnesota Ag BMP handbook, but also a bunch of other different resources, literature references, to come up with the best reduction efficiencies to put into SAM. The urban efficiencies are from the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, and then we developed some forestry practices and worked with we had an actual forestry SAM project, so the technical advisory committee on that, and then just pulling those from literature, working with those people to make sure that we have the most appropriate reductions. We'll have reductions for surface flow, interflow, and groundwater. The groundwater, I believe, is just for the nitrogen. And then the information sources, I think I already touched on for land use and point sources. That cost per treated area per year comes from the EQIP cost database. The suitable area that I talked about is we had to make some assumptions and do some spatial analysis in GIS to come up with that suitable area. And then the available area, there's actually an NPCA BMP tracking tool that shows where all of the BMPs have already been put in, so that we can reduce the area that we're looking at by that, what's already out there. Next, I'm going to talk about the updates that happened with version 2.0, and I am not even going to hit on half of them, but I'm hitting on my most favorite ones. So we added 19 new best management practices to SAM. There's 11 new cropland scenarios, 4 new urban scenarios, 2 forestry scenarios that were a part of that forest project, 2 feedlot scenarios, and a stream bank restoration scenario. So you can see all of the scenarios that are offered in SAM listed over on the right. We've made the land use change options more complex. You used to be able to just say, I want to change 2% of the cropland to developed, but now you can say, I want to double the developed in the watershed. So that's kind of a cool new thing, and it was just an option that I really wanted to have when I was working on some of my projects. So yeah, our mastermind set at that in. There's customized land use change group names, so you can take all the different types of forests that are represented in the model. Sometimes will represent different soils on forest, or old and new, and regenerating forests. So you can group those to do your land use changes, which I think is really cool. All these new point source alternatives, one that's really been helpful is adding a TMDL boundary condition. So you could say, well, I have an upstream TMDL, we're going to assume that they are meeting their total maximum daily load. How does that impact the downstream water quality? And then you can add a whole new point source now. We've separated in all the SAM projects every single point source to be separate, so you don't just have to do an increase kind of consistently. You can change any specific point source you want to in any of those SAM projects. And there's some new methodologies used to separate flow and concentrations, and for, like you can only change the flow from the point source or only change the concentration or both. You can do those in specific seasons only if you want to, or specific years. So there's a lot of cool options there. We did also improve the runtime with some programming that Seth did, and we made it handle some more complex reach connections. Sometimes it's a lot to explain, but just the way the reaches are connected in the model, it handles that a little bit better now. And you can run multiple, like you can make a SAM for the entire Lake of the Woods watershed that has all, I won't say 8 or more of those HUC aids included in it. So it'll feed from whichever one, it'll link all of those together to get to the end game at the Lake of the Woods. And there's an option now to select all of the upstream subwatersheds. So something that you sometimes want to do is know exactly what the contributing area is at any given point. So it'll do that for you. Make duration curves, pie charts, just all sorts of things. And this is just a small amount of them. The other ones get a lot more technical than these, so I didn't want to get into those. But said lots of new changes. I'm excited for you guys to get your hands on this SAM 2.0. And then lastly, how have we been using SAM at RESPEC? So if you see the plot or the map in the bottom left, those are all the models RESPEC has either built and developed or recalibrated or extended. So we've had our hands in a lot of the different HSPF models in the state. That SAM one is all of the different HSPF models that exist in the state that we've developed SAM projects for. And then these other ones are things that RESPEC has used those SAM and HSPF models to develop TMDLs for the Lake of the Woods, Sauk River, Mississippi Headwaters, Miss Brainerd, Snake, all sorts of watersheds here you can see in the map, and then RAPs for a lot of those as well. And then working on one watershed, one plans with these SAM and HSPF models as well. So what we do for the total maximum daily loads is evaluate the sources is a big one that we use this for. So you can see we took the sources out of SAM and made a pie chart with that. And that is a very important part of a total maximum daily load, is understanding where your sources are coming from at the outlet of an impaired reach. And then again, we'll pull the flows, loads, concentrations, whatever you need for that TMDL by specific season, by specific flow zone, for whatever years that you want to look at. A lot of times for TMDLs, you only want to look at the last 10 years, so you can really parse that out. You can pull all of the information you need to build a bathtub model. So again, point sources, septics, sources from different tributaries, whatever you need, you can pull with SAM, and then evaluating those point source loads and MS4 loads to develop your waste load allocations and make sure that they're not too high, that those point sources aren't impacting the DO or whatever you want to look at. You can do that with SAM. For RAPs, it's kind of the same game, but not necessarily just for the impaired reaches, it's for the entire watershed. So looking at where your sources are of all of your different pollutants and describing those, and then evaluating all the different what if scenarios that you might want to think about for your implementation planning down the road. So what if more development occurs? What if the forest is converted to ag land because corn prices skyrocket? All sorts of different things. You can look at how those are going to impact your loads in the future. And then for one watershed, one plans, it's just that prioritizing of different subwatersheds and land uses, and developing the most appropriate best management practice implementation plan for your watershed, so that you can get the most bang for your buck when it comes to people spending money on the ground to get load reductions at different places throughout the watershed. So helps to develop goals and target areas for that planning. This is kind of similar to what Paul talked about yesterday, Paul Marston, and if you guys were on his talk, but this linking to other tools for targeting. So he went through this spreadsheet tool we developed where we took the SAM loads and then we further broke those down by parcel so that we could really pinpoint where the loads were coming from and what area we wanted to do implementation on. That's a really cool tool that we developed working with the Shell Rock watershed. And then we've also linked SAM and HSPF to ACPF and other tools throughout Minnesota to evaluate where we really need to focus our efforts in a subwatershed. And then again, we've used it to permit point sources and determine how those loads from a point source will impact the downstream water quality. We've used it in water quality trading to develop attenuation factors, and used it to develop kind of statewide coefficients that to understand the water quality throughout Minnesota and where it's coming from, so where issues are coming from. And then again, my team and I have been running around Minnesota doing training for SAM so that you really know how to use it. It can be pretty complex. It's simple, but it's complex. It's hard to dig into all of the options. So we run around and train people so that they understand all of the options and how to get the right output and all of that stuff. But again, it's a lot more simple than having an HSPF model in front of you. It's really a great user interface. So that's all I've got. Questions?
Cindie, it looks like we do have a couple questions here in the chat. Let me just look real quick. So there's one from Brad and it states, could you please briefly describe the inputs analysis within the climate change module?
Yes, I can. It's not my area of expertise, but what I know is that there are three, let's see if I can go back to that slide. Yeah, so there's the three options. There's the mild, moderate, and severe climate change. And so it takes the existing precipitation and temperature time series that are feeding the model. And I'm not exactly sure how it chooses what is an extreme precipitation percent, but it does have some sort of algorithm to pick, the dry years versus the wet years. So it takes those events, the extreme events, and increases them for the mild by 4%, for the moderate by 8%, and the severe by 12%. So you're going to get a lot more moisture at once. And I think when it does give you that more moisture at once, that it kind of decreases it in other times of the year. And then it does this average air temperature increase as well. So it's kind of showing how climate change will increase. The mild, moderate, and severe is 1 degree, 2 degrees, and 4 degrees. We did start looking at, in Connecticut, some other ways of doing this as well. But it's really interesting to see how that air temperature increase changes the evapotranspiration and everything that's happening. So those big events, you'll see, peak flow increases, but then you'll see drier, times throughout the rest of the year because of those temperature increases. So does that answer that question? What's the other one?
We have another one that just popped up as well. And this one is from Josh asking if you have any upcoming trainings scheduled.
Oh my gosh, I don't know the dates, but I know there are upcoming trainings scheduled. If Josh, if you want to email me, I can send you the exact dates of those. My email is my first name dot last name there at respec.com if you want to write it down. And then I can email you the next training dates and where those will be. I know there's some coming up.
I don't see any other questions in the chat at the moment, but if you guys want to unmute at this point, you're welcome to. We still have about 20 minutes before the next session starts. So if any other questions would like to be addressed, feel free to unmute yourself at this point. I see one more thing here. Your email address. Okay. Can you just put that in the chat, please, Cindie?
Yep. Find the right screen here.
I can look it up too.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know where the chat is. I'm struggling.
Okay, I'll look it up real quick. There's another question that popped up from Catherine, and she was wondering what the licensing fees are.
There actually aren't any licensing fees. You can just go to, if you're in Minnesota, there's a SAM already for your watershed, right? So if you go to respec.com, I just went there on my screen. You go to products and then modeling and optimization and scenario application manager. And then you can go to download SAM now. See if it gets me there here. And then SAM file sharing, you can do all of the downloads that you need here. And there's also a bunch of training material that you can use that you can download at this location. And then all of the different watershed SAM projects, these are all still SAM 1.0. We don't have 2.0 up here yet, but it's coming soon. But all of the different HUC-8s that have one, you can just click and download. So they're all available to you in Minnesota. And if you have questions, feel free to, I think there's a link on here where you can contact us or, you know, set up a training and all of that stuff. So that, I mean, it would cost to set up a new training for you, but it doesn't cost anything to jump in and try to learn how to use this and stuff on your own and use those training materials.
Any other questions? I haven't seen anything come up in the chat, but you're welcome to unmute. If not, I think we are ready to close out this session. Cindie, thank you so much for your time this morning. And I also wanted to mention that RESPEC is one of our exhibitors this year. So thank you guys so much for your support and helping make this conference a success. Hopefully next year we'll be back in person where we can all see each other, you know, in a more of a personal aspect. So thank you all for attending. The next session will start at 10 a.m. and it's actually the same track as this one. So you can just stay on the Zoom link. Since we do have a little bit of time here, I'm going to put the movie video on the chat as well. So if you guys want to watch that, you're welcome to. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, the Best Picture award did go to Bassett Creek Watershed Management Commission. So congratulations again. Yeah, we'll see you all at 10 a.m. Thank you.